Something common I've noticed over the past few months obsessively covering this franchise is the praise received by Mega Man 5 on the Game Boy. Like, outside of Mega Man 2, I haven't seen such a solidified opinion amongst the fanbase about the quality of a game. The game was so loved by the fans that it was the first fully colorized by fans Game Boy Mega Man game, and for the longest time it was the only one colorized. And it was so good that it was considered the definitive way to experience the game. Now obviously, things might have changed a bit with the release of the Game Boy titles on the NSO recently. Having the convenience to play any of the Game Boy titles is probably going to shift the dynamic a bit, since beforehand, I think the majority of people that liked this game in recent years were emulating it. So I have to imagine more people are going to play Mega Man 5 in general, but it won't be the colorized version, which is a shame. Especially when you consider that at the time of writing, the first 3 Mega Man games have been colorized by fans as well, and the 4th one is set to release soon. Meaning all 5 Game Boy games are going to be available to play colorized by fans, and I think it would be the optimal way to experience these games if not for the NSO app being convenient. Regardless, if you haven't given the Game Boy games a go, I might recommend figuring out how to play the Game Boy games colorized. Seeing as how these games being on the NSO will inevitably allow people to experience the Game Boy titles, I gotta imagine the cemented opinion of these games might change a bit. Keep in mind, I like to write my scripts prior to actually doing research on the reputation of the games I'm reviewing so as to not allow biases to sway my opinions, and I thought the first Game Boy game was completely fine and a pretty easy run through. It was basically exactly what I expect from a handheld game based off the first and second Mega Man titles. A good way to kill an hour. Then I found out that general masses have their opinion that it's unfairly difficult, more so than Mega Man 1 on the NES, and people claim it has terrible controls. Which is super weird to me because I found the controls of that game to be significantly better than the NES title, even if the game itself was stripped down completely. Mega Man 2 for the Game Boy is seen as a completely inferior game and people scoff at it and say it's absolutely terrible, often suggesting that the music can burn a hole in your ears. Now admittedly, it might have sounded bad on the Game Boy, and I don't know if people's complaints are from playing it on the Game Boy specifically, but while I found the music to be inferior to the NES version, I thought the game as a whole was really fun and really easy and once again a solid way to kill 45 minutes if you're a fan of Mega Man. Quite frankly, I don't understand why it's specifically hated more than the other Game Boy games, but it feels like something that got sucked into an echo chamber. Mega Man 3 for the Game Boy was where many people started to suggest the handheld games got their bearings, with many citing it's a proper Game Boy game, still inferior to the console counterparts obviously, but a pretty good game if you want to experience handhelds. And honestly, I found it frustratingly difficult. And not difficult in the typical way, difficult because the stage layouts are very cramped and have way too many segments where the game slows you down to a halt and forces you to wait for enemies to allow you to attack for too long. And in addition to that, the game literally has moments that slow you down to a halt because this starts to chug when there's too much going on the screen. I didn't like Mega Man 3 for the Game Boy as a result. Mega Man 4 on the Game Boy I thought was good, and it was in line with how I felt playing Mega Man 2, but much better because it wasn't boringly easy. Prior to playing Mega Man 5, I said it was my favorite of the handheld bunch. It still borrowed a lot of the elements from the NES titles, but did a much better job making it feel as if it was its own unique experience. I'd even go as far as to say that Mega Man 4 is the first Game Boy game that could actually compete with the first 2 NES titles, when it comes to quality. Mainly because the first NES game is brought down by its slippery controls, and the second one is brought down by either having an overpowered Metal Saw in easy mode, or having a difficult mode being way too difficult to enjoy. But anyway, my point is that without preconceived notions of these games, I think I had a very different opinion of them when I experienced them compared to what the community thinks. And since these games are going to be available to so many people on the NSO, I imagine more people will have different opinions and determine new ideas as to which Game Boy games are considered the best ones. I'm not without precedence though, because the same thing happened with the Legacy Collection, where Mega Man's 4 through 6 began to receive praise more than the first 3 after those collections became available. As far as Mega Man 5 for the Game Boy is concerned, well, it's an improvement on 4. It is, by and far, in my opinion, the best Game Boy Mega Man game, and might even be up there for one of the best the old Game Boy library has to offer. The game is completely original too. New robot masters and everything. It's not attached at the hip to the NES games like the previous titles, all to a varying degree. It's very much its own game. So rather than spending this whole video figuring out if the game is good, I thought I'd do something a bit different. I want to analyze whether or not Mega Man 5 for the Game Boy, the best Game Boy title, is able to compete with the NES titles. And obviously, I think it's better than Mega Man 1 and 2 on the NES, since I thought those ones could compete with the 4th Mega Man Game Boy game. And this game is an improvement. So what I really want to figure out is where this game would slot in comparison to Mega Man 3 through 6 for the NES. And if you recall from my last video, I think 4 and 6 are top notch, followed by 5 and then 3. I'm also giving this game the best chance I could give it. I'm playing it colorized for that reason specifically. Otherwise, I'd have remained consistent and played it with the Game Boy Color palettes like I did the previous 4 Game Boy games, because I wanted to wait for all 5 Game Boy games to be colorized before covering them. Like I said, I want to give this one as fair as a shot as I can, so I'm going to go fully into it on the playthrough segment and review it in depth as I go through the game, rather than quickly summarizing the details like the story and the Robot Master weapons and items ahead of time like I normally do. Ladies and gentlemen, Mega Man V. The game starts off giving you some composition stating that the world is at peace thanks to Mega Man. It's delivered via text boxes. Suddenly, an unidentified flying object seems to be falling towards the Earth, and we get a scene of Rock and his sister Roll taking a scenic stroll with a backdrop of the mountains, before a mysterious being lands in front of them and calls Mega Man out. The figure is named Terra, and it wants to enslave Mega Man. Mega Man suits up and fires his Mega Buster at him, and Terra quickly defeats Mega Man, as he realizes his powers have no effect on him. Meanwhile, the camera pans over to a scene of the buildings facing attacks and text notifying us that the world is under attack by the mysterious warrior robots from space. Mega Man awakens not knowing where he is. Turns out Dr. Light found him and equipped him with the Mega Arm, which is known as the most powerful weapon ever devised. The final scene notifies us that the robot warriors from space, known as Star Droids, have attacked. I will most certainly be referring to them as Robot Masters unintentionally going forward, so there's no need to let me know in the comments that I'm wrong and they're not Robot Masters. Right off the bat, I have to praise the production value of this opening cutscene. The story is intense, the animations are top notch. Like, this is a handheld game, and I understand that I'm playing it colorized, but given what was done in Mega Man 4 was also really good quality, this is a spectacular introduction by the Game Boy standards. In Dr. Light's lab, he fills Mega Man in on everything you saw in the cutscene, which is good because if you skip the cutscene, you get all the story composition you really need. He also provides you with a new companion named Tango, a green cat. So now we have Rush, Beat, and Tango as companions in the series. Similar to Mega Man 4, there's a shop system in this game, where you get to collect P-chips to purchase items like energy balancers or different tanks for regeneration, as well as the ability to spend some P-chips to simply restock your ammo and health. And with that, we're sent on our way. You get a view of the Star Droids on your left and the Earth on the right as you pick one of 4 Star Droids to start your journey with. My one gripe here is the name of the Star Droids are not labeled, so you don't really know who you're facing off with until you click on them, and that sort of bugs me. But anyway, I decided I'd start off against Venus. The stage begins with bubbles hanging on the roof. Some of those bubbles are actually enemies that drop down to attack you. The next few areas introduce some flying enemies too. You'll also notice that the Mega Arm attack is in this game and it's basically the same thing as the Mega Buster, but instead you shoot out a giant fist that returns to you. The reach of it isn't quite as far as the Mega Buster, but for all intents and purposes, it feels the same to use. I didn't know this during my playthrough, but apparently you could use the Mega Arm to grab items tucked away similar to how the Ring attack could grab them in the previous game. There's also a new crab enemy that shoots a bubble at you, and if you get stuck in that bubble, you have to mash buttons to escape or it'll drop you onto spikes or into pits. You obviously still have your slide attack for tight spaces, and you'll come across some segments where waterfalls will be dropping down into pits, and if you get caught in the waterfall, you go down with it. The stage has many quick challenges and tight spaces to get through, but it's very manageable. You'll eventually run into these Russian doll types of enemies, as well as one of those owls with fans on them that'll pull you in. There are also a few chances to collect E-tanks, or other collectibles that might require careful platforming. Eventually, you'll run into Eddie and then make it into a section where the floor is bouncy and the roof is full of spikes, so you have to carefully traverse. As you continue along, you'll face similar challenges that will just up the difficulty a bit more, so you have to be careful and really think before you move. Eventually, you'll make it to your fight against Venus. As per usual, I took a quick death and came back with full health. The fully charged Mega Arm is really strong against him. He took out half my health, but I defeated him. I really appreciate the animation after defeating him, as there was a fun little tutorial that shows me how to use the bubble bomb. Also, we have the Rush Coil now. Next up, I decided to go after Neptune. This stage takes place atop some kind of ship that's bobbing up and down. You immediately face a few challenges with some fairly aggressive enemies. I got defeated pretty quickly, which is fine because the game over restocks everything. I found the bubble bomb very useful because it takes enemies down pretty quickly, even the stronger ones. And I found Tango not quite as useful, so I hope his use will come up later. Eventually you drop into the ship and you'll get to the areas of water flowing on the floor that you have to be careful to not allow it to carry you down into a pit. It's nothing we haven't seen in the series. You'll face off against enemies firing projectiles and flying enemies and the typical Mega Man stuff. Eventually you get to an area with cracks and pipes that are blowing out air that could damage you, so you have to carefully get around until you make it to short segments of underwater sections. As you continue, you'll once again have to decide if stopping to get collectibles or 1-ups or health regenerations are worth your time and effort, which for me, I'd say they usually are. The next segment takes place with a bunch of spikes, so you have to carefully maneuver through them before getting out to make it to Neptune. I tried out the bubble bomb, and while it did damage, it didn't really do enough. Neptune was super jumpy, and caused quite a lot of commotion in our battle. Thankfully, the pea shooter was useful as I mashed it towards him. The weapon received is called Saltwater, and it fires a projectile in an arc that explodes into 4 smaller projectiles. I think it's kind of funny that the first 2 weapons I got are bubble related, but thankfully they're used very differently. Also, in the first few stages I figured out that the Mega Arm is very useful. The pea shooter fires at a good rate, and the Robot Master weapons are actually very strong. So next up I decided to go after Mercury. His stage takes place indoors and includes a lot of conveyor belts, spikes, and firing enemies to throw you off. Also, a pretty enjoyable, if not relaxing soundtrack. You'll run into some funny slowpoke looking enemies too that'll just shoot things at you, as well as these robots that carry a saw around and attempt to slice you up, and some teleporting robots that might slow you down quite a bit. You'll finally make it to a section where the stage rises and drops, so you have to carefully make your way through it while destroying enemies in your path and not getting crushed. You'll get to some new enemies that have hammers, as well as some larger ones that'll shoot projectiles everywhere. I had to go through an E-tank by this point, and the sections on the conveyor belt required a lot of focus. The game did give me a 1-up though, but also then immediately made me fall into spikes I couldn't see, so I guess we're even. Anyway, I made it to Mercury. Tried the bubble bomb, but found it to be pretty useless. On the next life, I just stuck with the pea shooter. I learned his pattern pretty quickly, and it's easy to maneuver around and defeat if you're patient. The Grab Buster is an interesting weapon because if you shoot an enemy with it, you'll actually get to regain some of your health, which is very convenient. The final and first batch of robots is none other than Mars himself. The stage is filled with explosives. Almost all of the enemies will have some kind of exploding weapon they throw at you, except for the monkey that just throws bananas. Eventually, you get to a mini-boss. He's pretty easy to get through, but it's nice to see one of these mini-bosses again. Also, you'll do a fall down and hopefully avoid getting killed by spikes. After making it to a segment of rising platforms that you'll have to maneuver around to not end up getting killed by hitting spikes on the roof, some careful sliding challenges will also earn you an E-tank, and you'll just continue to face more exploding projectiles. I used the Grab Buster in the rematch against the sub-boss, and that got my health back up, so I just kept using it to keep restocking my health. That did unfortunately mean that I was out of ammo for it by the time I got to Mars, but I noticed that the saltwater attack was very strong against Mars anyways, so I used that to defeat him pretty easily, even if the last few shots had to come from my pea shooter, and with the defeat of Mars, you get the photon missiles, which are an exploding projectile similar to the drill bomb. Next up on the overworld, you get a new challenge, and it has Terra as the Robot Master. You're in the city with rockets in the background. You enter through a door. Mega Man looks around and finds nothing. And entering through the next door, Terra drops down and threatens to destroy Mega Man, and then leaves behind what he refers to as Dark Moon, which is another iteration of the Yellow Devil it seems. His patterns are much easier to dodge though, especially with the slide available. I had to use an E-tank though, so it's not completely easy, but it's a good challenge. After careful dodging and well-timed shots, Dark Moon is defeated. Eat that, Terra. Next up, we find ourselves in Dr. Light's lab, and he notifies us that the Rush spaceship is ready to use and take us to outer space. He does this because the Star Droids have been using Earth's resources to basically build an army of robot warriors that they plan on using to commit an all-out invasion against the Earth. So Mega Man volunteers to take his Rush spaceship up there and surprise them with an attack before they can attack the Earth. In the meantime, Dr. Light gives you a chance to restock some of your inventory with the P-chips that you've collected, which I actually appreciated by that point because I had forgotten that that was even a thing. Also, with 4 out of the 8 Robot Master stages defeated, I think it's good to point out that the music and level design for this game is pretty good, and the production value might actually be better than the NES titles, with the amount of composition we're getting in the game. Although I still think the NES titles look much better than what we're dealt with here, even with the colorized mods. I think the color does allow it to feel much more in line with the NES games than the grayscale would have, and I will also note that the stage challenges are very reminiscent of the previous Game Boy games, but the look, feel, and aesthetic is much better here because more detail has been given to the stages. That being said, the 4 stages did feel a bit samey. None of them really stuck out to me more than the other, and it was all very repetitive throughout. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, and it's not terribly uncommon for this franchise. But I will say that the ability to implement a bite-sized layout of the much larger screens available on the NES version is impressive, and the challenges don't feel cramped regardless of how much less space is available on each screen. Anyway, after I did a bit of shopping, I was ready to continue on my adventure. The following screen contains the next 4 enemies. This time you might be able to figure out that the big one is Jupiter and the one with the rings is Saturn. The smaller one is Pluto, and by process of elimination, the last one is Uranus. I decided I'd start with Jupiter. We're in space now, and the stage layout shows it. There are some robots that shoot charge shots at you, as well as flying magnet-looking enemies that drop sparks on the floor that'll chase you. Eventually, you'll have to get over some platforming areas with enemies shooting you from the ceiling, and some other rooms with enemies bouncing around or flying enemies that you have to maneuver around if you want collectibles. When you drop down, it's a similar challenge again, but as usual, harder. There were some blocks here that you could break to collect, but I don't think I had what was needed to break those blocks just yet. So I moved forward, had to use an E-tank, got to some slippery floors before heading back outside for once again similar challenges, but this time the floor is slippery. In my next area there was a split path, so I took the top path, but I found more of those blocks that I couldn't break with collectibles behind them, so I had to do the walk of shame back down and continue sliding my way through rows of enemies before making it to Jupiter. I messed around with some of the items, but seeing as how he was above me, I found the bubble bomb very useful and strong against him. Defeating Jupiter gave me the electric shock attack. Next up, Uranus. The aesthetic here actually changes. It has that Rocky Cave feel to it. Also, I found some more blocks that looked like they could break, but I also didn't have what was needed to destroy them, so I moved on and faced a weird Anubis looking enemy. It's actually a very unique sub-boss. Use the platforms to get up there and shoot him. Also, there are these rotating platforms you have to be quick to traverse across, as well as horizontal moving platforms that you need to climb up to get through various challenges. There are a bunch of seals that'll shoot projectiles at you. Some outdoor sections with flying enemies trying to knock you off your balance as you get through, and when you drop back down, you get to another match against Anubis. Again, I really like this fight. And shortly after that, you'll make it to Uranus. With some experimentation, I figured out the pea shooter was the only real option here. Actually, it was much better than I expected. Uranus uses a deep digger, and that allows you to carry those blocks I couldn't destroy. Next, I decided to go to Saturn. So at first I thought this stage looked too similar to some of the earlier ones, but it has these segments of lower high gravity that alter the way you traverse through the stage. There's also a sparkling gem I collected. I have no idea what that is. The 2G and 0.5G segments were a very cool thing to get around because it hasn't really been done before, and it requires you to be able to quickly adapt depending on how the gravity feels in different sections. It's overall a pretty easy stage, and Saturn was so easy to destroy with Jupiter's shock attacks. Beating Saturn gives you the Rush Jet and the Black Hole, and also that crystal I collected is one of 4 collectibles in this game according to Dr. Light. I didn't go after the remaining 3 during my playthrough, but quick googling says it gives you the energy saver, which I guess decreases the amount of energy your weapon uses, so that's pretty cool. Anyway, next up is Pluto. You're dropping down a lot of different screens at first, and each one gives you a different enemy or challenge. When you get to the bottom, there are some quick sections of bottomless pits where you have to quickly jump across, and then face an enemy that digs into the ceiling and roof with shots of windows to attack them. By now, the only real new thing in this stage are the platforms that quickly drop when you step on them. Everything else has pretty much been seen throughout the game. It's a challenging stage that does require your attention in a lot of sensitive locations though. You can't really just mindlessly move through it. What was pretty cool though is I eventually bumped into Proto Man, but it was very underwhelming because all he did was give me an ammo regenerator, but regardless, I liked hearing his whistle. Eventually I got to Pluto. I took a quick L for the health regeneration. I went back to him after and saw that he was really weak against the Grab Buster, so I probably could have just stuck with that instead of losing a life for the health regeneration. Pluto gives you Break Dash, which is basically this game's version of a melee attack. Once again, you get to Terra, and he speaks of a robot world and how he will destroy you. This time, you actually get to fight him. The pea shooter is pretty useful, but I also finally found my use for Tango here, who was easily able to help me knock Terra to the side. And Terra also gave me the Spark Chaser. Meanwhile, in the background, a giant ship starts to rise up with a familiar design on the front. Not sure why Mega Man is surprised, but I guess Wily did have to make his mandatory appearance. We get to go through a space shooter section that makes me laugh because I think this is really neat, but all I can think about is the amount of hours of discussions I've heard on Sonic videos about why these sections ruined that game. But that's not really today's topic. Anyway, this area actually puts a bit of challenge. I lost more health than I expected I would. It's not really a glorified cutscene, especially when you start to get attacked by the giant beams. You make it to a boss fight and it's massive. They actually shrink you down to highlight just how huge it is, and I totally appreciate that. Granted, the fight isn't all that difficult. It's pretty easy to time your dodges and unload a few charged up shots to hit the mouth of the cannon to defeat it. And after that, you can get on board. These are effectively the fortress stages. And like with so many fortress stages before, you get a lot of repeated enemies and challenges here. Ample opportunities to collect regenerators, as well as the ability to use Rush Jet quite a bit since this game knows you have it now. It's the basic stuff I've been saying all throughout the series. The challenge is good, and I like how they really go out of their way to include almost everything that's been used in the game. All of a sudden you get to a boss fight and whoa! Is that Anchor? That's so cool! They brought back the Mega Man killer from the first Game Boy title. I genuinely didn't know this was a thing, and so when I was playing it, I was genuinely surprised. Of course I couldn't even reflect on it that long. I had to be on my toes, but I knew right away I had to attack the sword and dodge the attacks and wait for him to jump to the other side of the screen. Easy enough. I got to refill my energy, drop down a long shaft, go through a few more challenges, and then all of a sudden, Quint! Nice. By now I realized they're probably bringing the whole cast back. And Quint brought his pogo stick too. This fight was harder than how it was on Mega Man 2, but still overall an easy challenge. Once again I dropped down, more typical difficult challenges, and then I got to face off against Punk. This time I let Tango join to help me out, and obviously shortly after that, Ballad. hopped around a lot, but not fast enough to defeat me. And then funnily enough, the stage continued. Eventually, I made it to the Robot Master elevator room. I got to go through all of the fights again, but this time I got to use their actual weaknesses. It took me approximately 8 minutes to get through all of them, and that's including the time it took for me to pause and pick the right weapon, as well as experiment for the Robot Masters that I hadn't figured out with the right weapon to use the first time. Regardless, I thought it was really cool that I got to go through the Mega Man killers as well as the boss rush here, and to some extent, I kinda wish Mega Man 6 on the NES had a super boss rush that allowed you to go against 1 or 2 robots from every game prior as an epic ending to the NES titles, because I think the way this game brought back the Mega Man killers was very unique and kinda awesome. But anyway, post-boss rush, you get to collect and refill a ton of your inventory. Proto Man once again gave me an item I didn't need. The first fight is against some giant fists that you just have to dodge and fire at will. It's pretty easy, you basically have to do the fight twice though, one for each hand. Next up is a fight against a gumball machine looking enemy. You have to beat the enemy that comes out of it before the gravity takes you up to the spikes, and then shoot at the time bomb over and over again, forcing it to explode next to the robot and forcing it to take damage. After that, it's Wily in a pretty straightforward standoff. Wily then flies off and summons Sunstar, a seemingly super strong robot that can destroy worlds. Sunstar quickly betrays Wily, which I thought was worth a chuckle. He introduces himself as a doomsday weapon, and then your fight against him starts. He wasted me pretty quickly on my first life. I spent the fight charging up the Mega Arm and hoping to dodge his attacks, and he made it very difficult. Every time the stage drops, his attack changes slightly, so you have to learn his pattern. He doesn't actually take that many hits, but his attacks pack a punch, so you have to be very careful while facing off against him. You'll ideally have an E-Tank or 2 to go into this, and when he's defeated, Mega Man will offer to help him, which confuses Sunstar, because he's only ever known Earthlings to be evil, and in a somewhat sad turn of events, Sunstar is won over by Mega Man's kindness, and tells him that he needs to get the heck out of there because he's going to explode now that he's been defeated. Mega Man escapes as the fortress explodes in the background in a climactic spectacle, and then you get your epic ending, somber animation of Mega Man sitting in a field staring off into the distance. This game is good. It's really good. The story is fun to follow along. The Robot Masters have very animated characteristics. Even Wily shows back up in the end credits, and his capsule explodes, forcing him to grovel one final time to end the Game Boy games. I really enjoyed this game. It is hands down the best one of the Game Boy titles, and I would recommend it to anybody that has NSO. It's a solid 2-hour adventure. However, go into this game with the thought that it is a handheld game, because at the end of the day, that's what it is. It may have many original set pieces and enemies and stages, but it still very much feels like a watered down NES title when it comes to level design. The stages are smaller, and the challenges are watered down in a way that's consistent with the previous Game Boy titles. Now, given that this game includes a charge shot and it has a story to keep you slightly more engaged, I can say it's better than Mega Man 1 and 2 on the NES. I said that earlier on. But this game is just not anywhere near the quality of Mega Man 4, 5, and 6. At best, I think it could compete with Mega Man 3, although 3 probably slightly edges it. But that shouldn't be seen as a bad thing. This is a Game Boy game after all, so the fact that it can compete with a console title at all is very impressive. Given I think that it's better than Mega Man 1 and 2, and better than the 4 Game Boy games prior to it, and obviously better than the PC games and the Game Gear game, that means in all of the classic games I've played so far, basically everything released before we made the jump to the Super Nintendo and entered a new world including the X series and 16-bit glory, out of everything before that, this game is really only surpassed by Mega Man 4, 5, and 6. And that's massive praise considering it's a Game Boy game. Minakuchi Engineering really outdid themselves. And it makes me very excited to take on the Wily Wars, because if this is what they were able to pull off on the Game Boy, I can only imagine what they were able to accomplish given a chance to recreate the first 3 NES games on a 16-bit console. As always, thank you so much for watching. Dean, out.